At 97, my red hair, which earned me the nickname Red, has long since lost its battle to time's gray. I'm Paul Grove, and I carry with me the turbulent waters of the Rhine River. It wasn't just a crossing. It was a moment that redrew not only the map of war, but the lines of my very existence. It was March 1945. I was only 19 years old and serving in the 271st Infantry Regiment. We had already fought through France and Belgium, but the Rhine represented something different. It was the last great natural barrier before the heart of Nazi Germany. The Germans knew this as well as we did, and had turned the opposite bank into a fortress. Our unit was positioned near Remagen, where the engineers had identified a potential crossing point. Sergeant Miller, a veteran who had fought in Sicily, had assembled our platoon the night before. "Boys," he said in his gruff voice, "tomorrow we're going to make history or die trying." That night, no one slept properly. I remember every detail of the equipment we were carrying. The M1 Garand rifle, 6 hand grenades, 180 rounds of ammunition, 3 days' worth of K rations, and a makeshift life jacket made from empty ration cans. The total weight must have been over 35 kilos, not to mention the fear that weighed on our hearts. At dawn, while we were preparing the assault boats, I got to know some of the men who would be in my group. Frank Martinez, a boy from New Mexico who always carried a photo of his fiancée. Bill O'Connor, an Irishman from Boston who kept making jokes to hide his nervousness. And Charlie Wu, our radio specialist, calm and methodical like a watchmaker. The first German artillery shot fell at 0415H, lighting up the sky like hellish lightning. Our artillery's response was immediate, creating a smoke screen to give us some cover. "Move out! Move out! Move!" shouted Sergeant Miller, and we began to push the boats into the water. The Rhine current was stronger than we expected. We rowed with all our might, but the river seemed to have a life of its own, wanting to drag us away from our goal. The noise was deafening. Explosions, screams, the metallic sound of bullets hitting the water around us. Martinez was praying in Spanish, his voice almost inaudible under the chaos. That's when I saw the first thing he hit. It exploded in a mixture of wood, water, and bodies. There was no time to process the horror. We had to keep rowing. O'Connor was hit in the shoulder, but continued rowing with one arm, his teeth clenched in silent determination. We reached the opposite shore under intense machine gun fire. "Get out of the boat! Seek cover!" I ordered, taking the lead when our corporal was wounded. The mud on the riverbank sucked at our boots, making every movement a struggle. Charlie Wu made contact with command, reporting our position as we dug in. The next few hours were a blur of short advances and intense fighting. We took German positions one by one, each meter gained costing lives on both sides. I saw young German soldiers, some looking even younger than me, fighting with the same desperate determination that drove us. By midday, we had established a significant bridgehead. The engineers began building temporary bridges to allow vehicles and supplies to pass. Martinez didn't survive to see that a burst of machine gun fire caught him as he protected our position. The photo of his fiancée, stained with blood, is still with me to this day. The success of the operation was crucial to the Allied advance, but the price was too high. Of our original platoon of 36 men, only 14 survived unscathed. O'Connor lost his arm, but survived to tell the tale. Charlie Wu received a Silver Star for his bravery under fire, keeping communications running even after being wounded twice. That crossing marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, but for us ordinary soldiers, it marked much more. It marked the moment when boys became men, when fear turned into courage, and when we learned the true meaning of brotherhood. Every time I look at the waters of a river, I remember the Rhine and the brave men we left on its banks. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the sound of the water lapping against the boats, the cries of the wounded, and Martinez's calm voice pray. The war changed us in ways that words cannot describe. We survived, yes, but a part of us remained forever in those turbulent waters of the Rhine. As we advanced along the Rhine that day, every meter we gained cost us more than just sweat and blood. It cost us pieces of our humanity. The formation we maintained was precarious, moving from cover to cover among the rubble and craters left by the artillery. Charlie Wu managed to make contact with the command via the drenched radio, informing them of our position and requesting support. His calm was surreal even with bullets whizzing around us. He kept his voice steady as if he were ordering in a restaurant. "Red," he called to me, "we need to hold this position until the second platoon crosses." O'Connor, still bleeding from the shoulder, organized our defense. "Keep your eyes on the windows of the buildings," he instructed, his voice heavy with the Irish accent that grew stronger under stress. "German snipers love high hiding places." He had barely finished speaking when a flash came from a third-floor window, and our companion Peterson fell without making a sound. It was at that moment that I really got to know my companions. Martinez, who moments before had been praying in Spanish, now showed fierce courage, running between positions to distribute ammunition. "Vamos, hermanos," he shouted, keeping our morale high even in the face of horror. Our position was being punished by enemy artillery when we spotted something that changed the course of the battle. An abandoned German NG-42 machine gun, still in usable condition. "Cover!" I shouted, and 3 men immediately started firing, while Wu and I crawled over to the gun. The NG-42 was known as the Bonesaw by the Allies due to its distinctive sound and lethal rate of fire. With Wu feeding the ammunition belt, we managed to establish a line of fire that kept the Germans back long enough for more boats to cross the river. During a lull in the fighting, O'Connor shared his last cigarette with us. "You know," he said, letting out a puff, "my mother wanted me to be a priest in Boston." We laughed nervously. Black humor was our only defense against the madness that surrounded us. The hours dragged on like days. We lost contact with other units, and our supplies began to run low. Martinez found some German rations in an abandoned bunker, and their chocolate was surprisingly good. "Better than our K rations," he joked, trying to keep his spirits up even in the darkest circumstances. It was at dusk that we faced our worst moment. The Germans launched a ferocious counterattack, using flamethrowers to dislodge us from our positions. The heat was unbearable, and the smell of burning fuel mixed with other odors that I prefer not to remember. Wu was hit in the arm while adjusting the radio, but continued to operate with a determination beyond human measure. "We need to retreat," shouted O'Connor, but Martinez refused. "No pasaran," he replied, quoting a slogan from the Spanish Civil War. His resistance inspired us to hold our ground, even when all seemed lost. Using smoke grenades, we managed to create enough confusion to repel the attack. In the evening, as we dug deeper trenches, Wu showed me a photo of his family in San Francisco. "My parents were interned," he said softly, referring to the concentration camps for Japanese Americans. "But here I am, fighting for America." The irony was not lost on either of us. O'Connor, even wounded, kept watch with impressive dedication. "If we survive this," he muttered, "I'll never complain about a day's work again in my life." Martinez nodded, adding, "I promise to take flowers to my fiancée every day." He never got the chance to keep that promise. The early hours of the morning brought a disturbing silence. The Germans had retreated during the night, leaving behind equipment and their dead. As we checked the perimeter, we found diaries and photos of young German soldiers who, like us, probably dreamed of a future they would never see. Wu finally got clear contact with the command. Reinforcements were on the way, but we still needed to hold our position for a few more hours. O'Connor, pale from blood loss, refused to be evacuated. "I'm not leaving you, you stubborn bastards," he said with a weak smile. Our unit had changed. We were no longer just soldiers following orders. We were brothers, united by something stronger than blood. Each man there was willing to die for the other, without hesitation. It was a bond that only those who have faced hell together can understand. The dawn brought a fine rain that mixed with the smoke from the still smoking rubble. As I watched our men reorganizing, I realized that war didn't just change landscapes, it changed souls. The young soldier who had crossed the Rhine less than 24 hours before was no more. Wu was working tirelessly on the radio, trying to coordinate with other units that had made it across. His wounded arm was bandaged with a torn piece of his own shirt, but he refused to be evacuated. "Red," he called to me, "Command says we need to advance another 2 kilometers up that hill." He pointed to a ridge covered with trees, partially destroyed by artillery. O'Connor, even with a broken shoulder, insisted on staying with the unit. "I didn't come all this way to be sent home now," he said, his voice weaker, but still carrying that Irish determination. We managed to convince him to accept morphine and a proper dressing, but nothing more. We reorganized our ammunition and equipment. Of the initial 14 survivors, 3 had to be evacuated due to serious injuries. We had 11 men left to continue the mission. Martinez's bloodied photo weighed heavily in my pocket as a constant reminder of the price we were paying. Diamond formation, I ordered distributing the men in such a way as to maximize our coverage. Wilson and Roberts up front, O'Connor and Wu in the center with the radio. I'll cover the rear. Each man knew his role. War has a unique way of turning complex procedures into pure instinct. Our advance was slow and methodical. Every house, every ruin could hide a sniper or a trap. The distant sound of artillery created an eerie background music to our progress. From time to time, we found evidence of the Germans' desperate resistance. Hastily abandoned positions, equipment left behind, personal letters smeared with mud. It was during this progression that we found something that none of us were prepared to see. In a partially destroyed basement, we discovered a German family, a mother with 3 small children. They were terrified, but what surprised me was the look on the mother's face. It wasn't hatred I saw on her eyes, it was exhaustion. The same exhaustion we were all feeling. Wu, who spoke a little German, talked to them briefly. "They've been here for 3 days, he translated. Her husband was a soldier, he died in Stalingrad." O'Connor, without saying a word, took some rations from his kit and offered them to the children. That moment humanized the enemy in a way that none of us had expected. We continued our advance, but that encounter changed something in all of us. War was no longer just about maps, objectives, and abstract enemies. It was about people on both sides caught up in something bigger than themselves. As we approached the hill, the German resistance intensified. Mortars began to fall around us, forcing us to disperse. Wilson was hit by shrapnel in the leg, but managed to crawl to cover. The noise was deafening, but I could still hear Wu broadcasting our position over the radio, his voice always calm, even in the chaos. "We need that observation point," I shouted, pointing to a partially destroyed house that offered a view of our route of advance. O'Connor, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, led a small group to take up position. I watched as they moved from cover to cover, every move calculated, every second precious. The house was taken after a brief but intense exchange of fire. 2 young German soldiers surrendered. They must have been no older than 16. When I saw them being escorted out, I thought of the family in the basement and wondered if those boys also had mothers waiting for them somewhere. From our new position, we could see our objective clearly. The hill was fortified, but not as much as we had hoped. The previous bombardments had done an efficient job of disorganizing the German defenses. Wu managed to make contact with the Allied artillery, and soon the air was filled with the familiar sound of shells whizzing over our heads. As we watched the bombardment, O'Connor sat down next to me, his face pale from blood loss. "You know, Red," he said, "after this is over, I don't think I'll ever be able to hear fireworks the same way again." I nodded silently, knowing exactly what he meant. Some sounds, some memories would stay with us forever. With the hill under our control, we set up defensive positions while more units crossed the Rhine. Exhaustion was beginning to take its toll, and we had been awake for more than 36 hours, sustained only by adrenaline and instant coffee from K rations. O'Connor finally agreed to be evacuated after his arm began to show signs of infection. "Don't let those bastards win," were his last words before being carried away by the medics. Wu helped make a makeshift tourniquet, his hand steady despite his own injury. "He'll live," said Wu with that characteristic certainty. "Irishmen are too stubborn to die." Our new position offered a panoramic view of the Rhine Valley. I watched the temporary bridges being built, thin lines of hope stretching across the dark waters we had crossed. Tanks and vehicles began to cross, their silhouettes jagged against the cloudy late afternoon sky. Wilson, still limping from the shrapnel in his leg, was coordinating our perimeter defense. "The Germans won't give up easily," he commented, adjusting his binoculars. "These hills are perfect for ambushes." His experience as a hunter in Montana was proving invaluable. During a break in the fighting, I found a diary in one of the abandoned German trenches. The pages were stained, and some of the words were illegible, but Wu managed to translate passages. It was from a young German officer describing his last days defending the Rhine. His words echoed a mixture of duty and despair that made me question the nature of the conflict. He knew he was fighting a losing war, Wu commented as he translated, but he continued out of honor and loyalty to his men. I kept the diary in my equipment. Perhaps one day I could return it to the officer's family. In the evening, we received orders to prepare for a larger advance the following morning. While distributing the guard positions, I noticed how our group had changed. Of the 11 who had reached the hill, only 8 remained. Each casualty left an emptiness that went beyond the physical loss. It was as if part of our own humanity was disappearing with each lost companion. Roberts, our demolitions expert, discovered a partially intact German ammunition dump. "We can use this," he said, carefully examining the boxes of grenades and ammunition. "Better that it falls into our hands than theirs." I passed on the coordinates to Wu to pass on to command. Information like this could save lives. During my guard shift, I reflected on Martinez and his bloody photo. I thought of all the letters his fiancée would never receive, all the dreams that died on that riverbank. War has a cruel way of turning bright futures into painful memories. Wu joined me in the vigil, his wounded arm now properly bandaged. "You know, Red," he said softly, "when this war is over, I'm going to look for my parents in that internment camp. I'm going to show them that their son fought for America, even when America didn't trust him." His determination was an inspiration to us all. The first signs of dawn brought with them the distant sound of engines as our armored column approached. Wilson identified the vehicles by their sounds. Sherman, 2 more. No, 3, and some M3 transports. His ability to distinguish mechanical sounds was almost supernatural. We prepared our positions for the imminent advance. Each man meticulously checked his equipment: ammunition, grenades, rations, medical supplies. The war had taught us that details made the difference between life and death. Roberts handed out some of the captured German grenades, explaining the differences in the detonation mechanism. The rising sun revealed a landscape transformed by the war. The natural beauty of the Rhine Valley was marred by craters, destroyed vehicles, and trenches. Yet there was a strange beauty in that destruction, as if nature itself was witnessing our struggle and moving on, indifferent to human conflict. Wu received the coordinates for our next objective, a small town 5 kilometers away. "They say there is moderate resistance," he reported, "but our reconnaissance planes identified troop movements during the night." We studied the maps, planning our route through terrain that alternated between dense woods and open fields. The war was changing, we could feel it. It was no longer just about conquering territory. It was about ending something that had gone on for far too long. Every soldier, American or German, carried that weight. As I watched my men prepare for another day of combat, I realized that we were no longer the same people who had crossed the Rhine. The war had changed us, but it had also brought us together in a way that only those who have faced hell together can understand. The advance to the small German town was more difficult than we had expected. Wu was right about the movement of troops. The Germans had regrouped overnight, turning every house and street into a defensive position. Even with the support of the Sherman tanks, every meter gained cost precious lives. "Red, we've got problems," Wilson whispered, watching through his binoculars. "Sniper in the church tower." He had barely finished speaking when a bullet hit the wall next to us, sending brick fragments in all directions. Wu immediately started calling for artillery support, but I hesitated. Destroying a church, even in war, seemed wrong. Robert suggested an alternative. "I can go around the back with a small team. That tower has to have internal access." The plan was risky, but better than turning a religious symbol into rubble. I selected 4 men to accompany him, including Peterson, our best marksman. While Roberts and his team moved, we kept the sniper busy with suppressive fire. Wu coordinated our position with other units converging on the city. The Germans are concentrated in the center, he reported. It looks like they turned the town hall into a command post. The operation at the church was a success, but it cost Peterson his life. Roberts later told me that he died protecting a young German soldier who had surrendered, a boy of just 15 who was crying for his mother. Even in his final moments, Peterson maintained his humanity. The sniper who was captured was an older man, a veteran of the First World War. With the tower neutralized, our advance gained momentum. The Sherman tanks cleared the way, their caterpillars crushing the debris as they advanced through the narrow streets. The noise of the engines and explosions was deafening, but beneath it I could hear something more disturbing: the cries of civilians hiding in cellars. Wilson discovered a group of refugees in a small warehouse, entire families fleeing the Soviet advance in the east. They're more afraid of the Russians than of us. Wu translated their stories. We share our rations with them, especially the children. War is war, but some things transcend conflict. The battle for the town hall was particularly brutal. The Germans have fortified every window, every door. Roberts used his last demolition charges to create a breach in the side wall, allowing us to enter. The ensuing combat went from room to room, floor to floor. Wu was hit again, this time in the leg, but continued to operate the radio from his position on the second floor. It was during this fight that I encountered something that would change my perspective forever. In a room at the back of the building, I discovered documents and photographs that were evidence of the horrors the Nazis had perpetrated. Wu, even wounded, helped translate some papers. What we read left us silent for several minutes. The war had many faces, and some were more monstrous than we could have imagined. The last defenders of the town hall surrendered at dusk. Among them was an SS officer who tried to destroy documents until the last moment. When we captured him, he had an air of arrogance that contrasted with the fear in the eyes of his young subordinates. Wilson had to restrain me when the officer made a derogatory comment about Wu. Some provocations are hard to ignore. We established our command post in the prefecture, transforming the symbol of Nazi authority into a center of Allied operations. Wu, finally accepting medical treatment, coordinated the arrival of reinforcements and supplies. Roberts organized teams to scour the rest of the city, looking for hidden enemy soldiers and civilians in need of help. The night brought a temporary calm. Sitting in a chair that had probably belonged to some Nazi bureaucrat, I wrote letters to the families of the men we had lost. The letter to Martinez's fiancée was the most difficult. How to explain that her future husband died protecting values that transcended borders and ideologies? Wilson set up an efficient defensive perimeter, taking advantage of the positions the Germans had prepared against us. Ironic, he commented, to use your own defenses to keep them out. War is full of these little ironies, I thought, as I watched the stars through a broken window. Dawn brought news over the radio that other units had made significant advances across the front. German resistance was beginning to crumble. As I relayed the updates to the men, I realized that we were witnessing the beginning of the end. The question was, how much more blood would be shed before the last shot was fired? The city was under our control, but the war wasn't over yet. Over the radio, Wu, even though wounded, continued to receive reports from other units advancing through Germany. Each message brought news of more cities falling, more German units surrendering, more evidence of the imminent collapse of the Reich. Red, Wu called me one morning, his voice more serious than usual. I'd just received information about concentration camps being discovered in the east. The silence that followed was deafening. Those documents we found in the town hall were beginning to make even more sense, revealing only the tip of a much greater horror. Wilson organized regular patrols around the city, keeping our men on their toes. The most dangerous are those who have nothing left to lose, he said, referring to the SS fanatics who still resisted. Roberts agreed, sharing stories he had heard about Nazi officers choosing suicide over surrender. The streets began to show signs of life again. Civilians cautiously came out of their hiding places, first just to get food and water, then to try to rebuild some semblance of normality. Children played among the rubble, their laughter a surreal contrast to the surrounding battle marks. One afternoon, while I was supervising the distribution of supplies, an elderly woman approached me. Through Wu, she told me that her grandson had been forced to join the Wehrmacht in the last months of the war. He was only 16, she said, showing me a yellowed photo. Did you see him? I had no answer to give her, just another tragedy in an ocean of losses. The days turned into weeks. We received reinforcements and our unit was reorganized. Of the original men who had crossed the Rhine with me, only Wu, Wilson, and Roberts remained. We received a letter from O'Connor from the hospital. He had survived but would lose his arm. At least now I have an excuse not to play the harmonica, he joked in his message. The news of Hitler's death came like a whisper that turned into thunder. The streets were filled with soldiers celebrating, but I noticed that many veterans, like me, maintained a solemn reserve. We had seen too much to celebrate the death of any man, even our worst enemy. You know what's weird? Wilson commented as we watched the commemoration. I thought I'd feel different when it was over. I understood perfectly what he meant. The war had changed us in ways we were only beginning to understand. Wu finally received news from his family that they were alive, still in the internment camp in California. I'm going to get them as soon as I get back, he said, determined. I'm going to show them that there is still good in the world. His strength always impressed me, fighting for a country that distrusted him, without losing faith in humanity. Robert spent his last days in Europe documenting everything we encountered. Someone needs to record this, he would say, photographing both the destruction and the small victories of reconstruction, so that no one forgets, so that it never happens again. When the demobilization orders started arriving, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. War had become our reality, our routine. Peace seemed a distant concept, almost frightening in its normality. How are we going to get home after everything we'd been through? On the eve of our departure, I gathered the men together for one last reflection. Together, we raised a silent toast to those who had fallen by the wayside: Martinez with his dreams of marriage, Peterson with his final courage, and so many others whose names we would carry forever in our hearts. The war is over, said Wilson, but it will go on inside us. He was right. Every distant explosion, every sudden noise, every nightmare would be a reminder of what we lived through on the banks of the Rhine and beyond. Wu, before leaving for his own destiny, handed me his notes from the war. So that your story can be told correctly, he explained, so that people know that we fought not just against an enemy, but for something greater than ourselves. Now, so many decades later, I reread those notes and touch Martinez's bloodstained photo. Time has softened some memories, but others remain as vivid as they were in that March of 1945. Crossing the Rhine was only the beginning of our journey, a journey that took us through hell and back, turning young soldiers into men marked by history. The war taught us that humanity is capable of the most heroic acts and the most terrible atrocities. But it has also shown us that, even in the darkest hours, there is light in the courage of men like Martinez, the determination of Wu, the loyalty of O'Connor, the wisdom of Wilson, and the conscience of Roberts. Today, when young people ask me about the war, I tell them not just about the battles, but about the men I met, the lives we touched, and the lessons we learned. Because in the end, it wasn't just a war we won, it was a fight for the very soul of humanity.